right, so we begin period 5 today, and period 5, it ranges from 1844 to 1877. So it goes all the way through the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then the period leading up to the Civil War, which is called the antebellum period. Now, we begin in 1844 with one of probably, I'm not going to say one of the most significant events in history, but it is significant for American history as it goes toward changing a lot of the demographics of America with the Irish potato famine. Irish people are an interesting folk. They had been under the heavy hand of their British overlords for hundreds of years. And in the 1840s, a terrible potato blight or a rot, their crops of potatoes would just rot in the ground as a result of this blight, which caused famine. And what is famine?
No food.
Yeah, widespread starvation is famine, lack of food. And the Irish people were dangerously dependent on the potato. So when about 25% of their potato crop dies of disease, then that leads to widespread problems, particularly for the poorest of the Irish population. It was not uncommon to see starved, dead bodies on the side of the roads with grass in their mouths, trying to eat something. Literally people starving to death. All told, about 2 million people died of starvation in Ireland as a result of this potato famine. So, needless to say, if you imagine you and your family are starving to death, you're going to try to do anything you can to survive and hopefully escape. So during this time, tens of thousands fled the land of famine and went to the land of plenty, which is America. So this time period in Irish history is called the Black 40s. The Black 40s. And in the 1840s, Ireland's greatest export was its people. And they fled Ireland and left Ireland in droves. Now, these people that are leaving are starving. These people that are leaving are poor. So when they arrive in America, they have no means to travel. I mean, it was probably their entire life savings, and they sold their homes and their land just to get passage across the Atlantic to get to America. So when they arrived, they were too poor to move west. They couldn't buy land or livestock or equipment. And so basically they stayed in the seaboard cities like New York, Boston. New York very quickly became the largest Irish city in the world, meaning there were more Irish people living in New York than in any city in Ireland. That's how many people fled Ireland and stayed in New York. It becomes the largest Irish city in the world. So these luckless Irish immigrants, they did not, receive red carpet treatment. And this is pretty much a theme for immigrants in American history. Not very many are treated well. So, and they came in great numbers. I mean, you can see Irish immigrants to the United States, very kind of steady. And then in the 1840s, there's a massive spike as a result of the potato famine. When they arrive, they're forced to live in squalor. What's squalor? I love that word. Yeah, bad conditions, slums, ghetto, literally.
When they were forced, does it mean they just put them in the back? They put them.
like the worst parts of town.
Like they couldn't, like they put them there, or they just couldn't afford to move.
They couldn't afford to go anywhere else.
So
And
they wouldn't give them any money.
yeah, right. So they were already, and they were cramming into these places, cramming into these already vile, disgusting slums, and not much of a chance to succeed. They were the people that were already in these places, the proper Americans. They kind of scorned these poor immigrants, largely for a couple reasons. The main reason why the Irish immigrants were looked down upon was because they were Catholic, and the people of Boston and the people of New York were settled by especially Boston, very puritanical. You think of the Pilgrims who came to America to purify the Church of England, and hated Catholics even in the 1600s. So when these, as you can see, hundreds of thousands of Irish begin to flood into their cities, they're not very pleased about it. They regarded these Catholic arrivals as a social menace, as a problem. And they even gave them nicknames. They called the girls Biddies or Bridgets, and the boys Paddies or Patricks. Nicknames. And these, the women, these Irish immigrants, they're barely literate, if they even were, and they basically took whatever jobs they could get. The women worked as kitchen maids, and men pick and shovel drudgery of digging canals and railroads. Very difficult for an Irishman to get a job, because they were so hated and because they were so numerous. Jobs were hard for them to come by. In fact, many store and shop owners and businesses began to hang signs in their windows that say they need help. They want Irish, or they want labor, but they don't want the Irish. No Irish need apply. Some places they would just put up signs that say Nina, N-I-N-A, no Irish need apply, because they were so common. And you can actually, you go to places like the Smithsonian, they have these signs from the 1850s that just say Nina on them, and it says no, and it means no Irish need apply. Very, very common to see this at factory gates. The Irish were, but it's not like the Irish were like loving people. They also, had hatred for others, in particularly the free African American inhabitants of the North. Why do you think the Irish were so racist toward African Americans?
They've taken their jobs.
Because they had to compete with the free blacks for the same low-level jobs. They were competitors with one another. They both shared society's basement. They were at the bottom rung of society. And so it was not uncommon to see very fierce and violent race riots in Irish and black communities throughout the port cities. So the Irish tended to remain in the low-skill occupations, but they gradually improved their lot and gradually improved their station in life. But it took some time. How do you think the Irish were able to improve their station?
Becoming Protestant?
Good guess. But no, they did not.
Opening their own stores and stuff?
Okay. It has to do with their the sheer numbers of them. So many came that they're no longer a minority. And when it comes down to election time, they have the right to vote. Yeah, because they were made Americans over time. And so they actually begin to win elections and hold office, and they're able to pick themselves up because they're able to, dominate certain parts of government life. One place in particular where the Irish began to dominate were in big city police departments. Big city police departments, where they become the law. In fact, if a police officer in New York or anything dies in the line of duty and they have a funeral, what's the funeral like? What are played? Bagpipes, because it's very traditional Irish heritage. Even like, what's one of those big police vans called? You put a bunch of people in, like a bunch of prisoners in. Yeah. A paddy wagon. Why is it called? Where do you think that name comes from? The Irish, the paddy wagon. Irish have a stereotype about them that they're drunks, and so it was thought that the police would have to round up all the drunken Irish and then throw them in the back of the police van. Hence why it was called a paddy wagon. Okay, but over time the Irish became the ones driving them because they began to dominate the police. Now, obviously, they didn't have cars in the 1840s, but literally a wagon. Okay, so all told, between 1830 and 1860, about 2 million Irish people immigrated into the United States, and most of them stayed on the seaboards of Boston and New York in particular. All right. So this is just kind of telling you about it and the things that they're going to experience in their long road to equality are numerous, and we're going to talk about those throughout this antebellum period. But they are not the only immigrants coming to the United States at this time. Another group are the Germans. Germans began to migrate to the United States between 1830 and 1860 as well. Much less spectacular than from Ireland, but about 1.5 million Germans came to America. Most of them were just uprooted farmers who had crop failures or other hardships. Some were a very tiny sprinkling of political refugees who were saddened by like the fall of democracy in Germany, and so they left. But that's a very, very, very small number. But the Germans actually, Germany's loss was America's gain. Not to say that the Irish coming was not a gain for America, because it was. But unlike the Irish, many of the German immigrants came from modest means, meaning they had a little bit more money in their pocket. So they were able to push a little bit further inland. So unlike the Irish, they had a modest amount of material goods. And they were able to push into the lands of the Midwest, Michaela.
Since the Irish, they were only able to really settle in the east and southern ones, you said they weren't able to really go north.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that the reason that we sound southern? Is that where it started?
What do you mean we?
Dialect and stuff like that. Is that an example of how?
Which dialect?
The southern accent, because.
I would say that is more of comes from the Elizabethan English, as opposed to the Irish. And a lot of Scots-Irish people settled in Appalachia. Mm-hmm. That is all true. We're going to talk about that. Okay. It's a good question. Back to the Germans. The Germans, they had a little bit more money, so they were able to push into the Midwest. You can see by this kind of mosaic map, it shows the darker red areas are the most heavily, the densely populated with German. Okay, and you can see a lot of German immigrants in this time going to places like Wisconsin, Illinois, and, Minnesota.
All the cheese and beer and stuff up there.
I would say that's more of a function of like cows, that cow, farmland. Like if we had massive farmland for cows, we'd have lots of cheese here, but we just don't. But yeah, beer for sure, beer for certain. Okay, the Germans love their beer. So anyway, unlike the Irish, the Germans are more scattered, and so their vote is a little less potent because they're not as densely populated as the Irish were in just those cities. But the Germans still had some influence on shaping American life, like Conestoga wagons. You ever heard of those? It's a German thing. That's one of the things we took west with us. Conestoga wagons. Anybody put up Christmas trees in your homes? Nobody did that until the Germans came. The Germans brought that's a German tradition. Okay, what else? Kentucky rifles. That's actually brought from the Germans. And all of these are contributions to American culture. But Germans had fled the militarism and the wars of Europe and consequently become very the poster boy for isolationism because they go all the way to the middle of the country and they just stay there, all right, and then they're on their own for quite some time. German people tended to be much better educated. They were willing to pay to have schools built in their communities. Public schools were important. They even created schools of their own where children as young as 5 could be educated so that the kids could grow in their education. They even have a word for their schools. You guys know what the Germans called their schools? Kindergartens. Kinder, meaning child, kids. Garten, what happens in a garden? Stuff grows. Child growth, kindergarten. That's so. How do you say German in German? How do you say Germany or German in German language? Deutschland. So, and if you speak German, you sprechen Sie Deutsch. So whenever an average American who speaks English hears these people sprechen Sie Deutsch, they get called the Dutch. They're not Dutch. Like, have you ever heard of the Pennsylvania Dutch? They're not Dutch. They're German. So and you see sprinklings of German culture this time period all throughout America. You guys ever watch The Office? Dwight? What other language does Dwight speak? German. He's Pennsylvania Dutch. Okay? Some of these Germans were so isolated that they still can live their entire lives in America and never learn English.
Like the Amish?
Very much like the Amish, like the Mennonites.
That's weird.
Well, it's just their culture. Okay? So, the biggest hurdles that many of the Germans faced was they're hardworking, industrious people, but many of them that did come like to drink their beer on Sundays on their day off, and many Protestants had major problems with that. So the Germans and the Irish are definitely two groups of people that bring the abolition of alcohol to become a national issue, which eventually does happen. Not allowed to have any alcohol at all at some point. It begins with the German and the Irish, and you can see here, how this is a political cartoon from the time period. You see an Irishman representing a whiskey barrel, and the German representing a beer. And what are they doing here? What are they carrying? a ballot box. So what are they doing with it? They're running away with it. They're running away with the ballot box, meaning they're winning elections in certain places. So as a result of these German and Irish immigrants coming in such great numbers to the United States, you begin to see prejudice rear its ugly head by many Americans who call themselves nativists or natives. Now, who are these natives? Explain to me the demographic of a native. Are they Native Americans? Jenna, what did you say?
Someone born and raised in America.
That's true. Gracie, what did you say? Just an American. Are they white?
Yes.
Are they Protestant?
Yes.
Where are they from? What would be their descent? English. Okay. Now they're American. They're born in America, but they're white, they're Anglo-Saxon, they're Protestant. You may refer to these people as WASPs. WASPs, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. All right. Now, these WASPy people are afraid that the hordes of immigrants coming to the shores of America would eventually outbreed and outvote them in their old native stock. Not only did the new immigrants take jobs from native Americans, but they were also, a significant portion of them were Roman Catholic. And, a lot of Americans were afraid of Catholicism, which is silly. Why do you think many Americans were so fearful of Catholicism? It's a silly idea. Well, the Catholic Church has a person who's the head of the church. Who is that person? The Pope. Now, what is it? Now, Americans look at this and they see one person in charge. And if you related that to government, monarchy or dictatorship. Okay, so Americans were fearful of, they saw the Catholic Church as a foreign church, and they were fearful that, that if the Catholics were able to take power in the United States, that it would be, all the authority of the U.S. would be turned over to the Pope, which is kind of silly, But, Catholics really didn't want to be, were not interested in assimilating into American culture at first. They even created an entirely separate education system, which is why, Catholic schools are one of the largest private schools in America. Like, there's even one in our home in Beckley. Okay, so, which was an enormously expensive undertaking for a population of people that were extremely poor. So, but that just kind of reveals the strength of their religious commitment. Catholics became a very powerful religious group. In 1840, Catholicism was the 5th largest religious group in America, behind the largest were Baptists, then Methodists, then Presbyterians, and then Congregationalists. So it was in 1840, it was Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and then Catholics.
What is it now?
Catholics is number one. In 1850, Catholics became the most powerful religious group, the most numerous, which is a position that they've never lost. Largest religious group in America. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First off, because one of the things we're going to talk about is, the Second Great Awakening causes a lot more splits in Protestantism. There's like 85 kinds of Baptist churches. There's only one Catholic church, and it's the same all over the world. The word Catholic means universal. So a Catholic in West Virginia has the same beliefs as a Catholic in Russia. It's the same. Okay? All right, so, still though, many Americans, the old stock nativist Americans, were still fearful of this alien riffraff, and that they would, fearful that the Catholic Church would establish a popish idol for Americans to follow. And so they began to organize themselves. And one of the groups that they began to organize in was a political party. And the name of that political party is called the Know Nothing Party. It was their nickname. It was actually called the American Party. The Know Nothings for short. They became known as the Know Nothings because of their secrecy. It was originally formed as a secret society, as a secret. Freemasons could have been members of the American Party, as Freemasons are definitely anti-Catholic. But the Masons is not a political party. And they would have existed long before.
What about the anti-Mason party, though?
The anti-Masonic party is not the same. Is not the same. All right, so the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, which is its nickname, and it gets this nickname from its secrecy. Nativists were upset and agitated, and they wanted to see immigration laws be stronger, more rigid immigration laws to prevent further immigration. They also wanted to see laws that would deport immigrants who were basically just poor. They wanted to deport impoverished people. So needless to say, you have two very distinct sides emerging here. And the sides are being created along the lines of your faith. All right? So pretty soon, if you look at history, people who have different faiths, they don't really get along very well, do they? No, they don't. And pretty soon, violence begins to emerge in America between these two lines. You see, a Catholic convent was burned down in Boston. You guys know what a convent is?
Like a nun place?
It's a house where nuns live. They burned it down by a mob. A mob burned it down. You saw attacks on Catholic schools. Catholic churches burned. Fighting in the streets. And these outbursts of intolerance were not, a frequent occurrence, but they did happen. And they were generally localized in larger cities. But it does remain a very unfortunate mark against America and America's treatment of minorities. And the Irish are just one in a long list of minorities that have been treated poorly in America. But undeniably, all of these immigrants are making America a more pluralistic society, more of a melting pot. And to this day, and even in the 1840s, America was the most ethnically and racially varied country in the world. Especially today it is. Okay? So questions on Irish immigration, German immigration, and what happens as a result of it so far. White people getting angry about it. White Protestants getting angry about it. Okay. All right, so this begins in like the 1840s, all right? Now I want to go back in time a little bit, all right? We're going to talk about this guy. His name's Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater is known as the father of the factory system in America. All right, so back in the 1750s, there were some British inventors who began to perfect a series of machines for mass producing textiles, big textile machines. And they used steam power to energize their machines, and they were able to increase their production of textiles, cloth, by 10,000 times over a person by hand. So when they began to usher in a modern factory system, it really begins what is called the Industrial Revolution, which begins in England around the 1750s. The English were not willing to share their plans for the machines. The English had a monopoly on the factory system. Britain was kind of the world's workshop. Yep, 1750s. Now, America was less interested in getting on board with becoming an industrial giant. Unlike in England, where they were totally on board with becoming an island factory. That's what they were totally cool with that. America, less likely to do that because America had lots of land. It was cheap. Land-hungry peasants were not going to coop themselves up in a smelly factory when they would be able to till their own acres in fresh air and sunlight. So labor in America was generally scarce in the early period of the Industrial Revolution because most people wanted to own their own land and farm, and I get it. But by the 1840s, what is in great supply? Workers. Because why? Immigrants. Lots of poor immigrants willing to work for next to nothing. By the 1840s. When immigrants began to pour ashore, there was lots of labor to be had. But the British still had a monopoly on the textile industry. Until this man, Samuel Slater. Okay, so I don't want to confuse you. 1840s comes. That's when our industry really takes off because we have this labor. That's not to say that factories didn't exist because in 1791, Samuel Slater builds one of the first American spinning factories. Samuel Slater was a British guy.
What year did you say?
1791. He was a mechanic. He worked on the machines in England. At every British factory, they never had all the blueprints in one place for the machines. They were so secret because they didn't want anybody to compete with them. All the blueprints were kept separately. And he was a mechanic and was only allowed to work on certain parts. But he got his hands on each set of blueprint and he memorized them. And then he left and he came to America and he built his own factory, making him the father of the American factory system by doing corporate espionage, really. He stole the plans. So he escaped. He actually disguised himself. He escaped in disguise. Someone else. Not Samuel Slater. All right. So in 1791, he puts into operation the first American machine for spinning cotton thread. All right, so now we have this machine that can spin cotton thread. And we can spin it faster than we can actually produce it. Because in order to get cotton thread, you have to get it from the field and then you have to clean it.
Wait, I thought that's what Eli Whitney did.
Eli Whitney invented a machine called the cotton engine.
Oh.
Okay. What the cotton, it's called cotton gin for short. Gin stands for engine. What this machine does is has you guys ever seen cotton in its natural form, like off the plant? All right, what's it look like when you pull it off the plant?
It has like leaves and stuff in it.
Leaves and seeds. Teeny tiny little seeds. I'm talking like if you take your pen and just kind of drop it on your paper, that's how big a cotton seed is. And each cotton ball, I guess, is full of seeds. Okay? Now, if you try to just throw that cotton without getting the seeds out of it, it's going to gunk up Samuel Slater's machine. So it has to be cleaned. Now, before Eli Whitney invented this cotton gin, it had to be picked by hand. And hand picking 1 pound of cotton lint, was a full day's work. It was a full day's work. So it was a process that was expensive, and it also made cotton rare. In fact, slavery was almost on its way out in the 1790s. Many Americans thought it was going to die on its own. But when Eli Whitney invents this cotton gin and makes the picking of cotton extremely easy and efficient, what happens to, what does that mean for cotton production? Is it going to go up or down? It's going to go way, way up, because now there's a machine that can clean the cotton and clean it as fast as you can spin the crank, and now you can get it to eat Samuel Slater's machines and turn that cotton into thread. Now you just need what? Why do you need so many slaves now? To produce the cotton, to grow it. All right? So Eli Whitney, who is a Massachusetts-born man, anti-slavery, does more to cement slavery in American culture and American society than any other person.
What a moron.
Well, he likes money. So his cotton gin, which separates the seed from the cotton fiber, was 50 times more effective than hand picking. And this machine changes the history of not only America, but the world. Because almost overnight, the growing of cotton becomes highly profitable. Highly profitable. And human slavery, which had been dying out, was now, the chains were going to be riveted to the limbs of downtrodden southern slaves. Because it's going to be so needed, necessary. Bummer. Okay, I will stop there for today.